The mahogany-paneled walls of the Gilded Lyre seemed to absorb sound, creating a hushed reverence that was the restaurant's signature. But tonight, that silence was shattered. A billionaire's roar of indignation echoed off the crystal chandeliers, causing waiters to halt mid-stride and diners to lower their silver forks with a clatter. All eyes were fixed on the imposing figure of Sterling Blackwood, a man whose face was a permanent fixture in the financial news, as he loomed over a young waitress, her body trembling like a leaf in a storm. He was a predator, and she was his prey, his words dripping with a venom designed to humiliate and destroy. No one dared to intervene until the waitress, after a lifetime of bowing her head, finally looked up. One sentence, spoken with a quiet clarity that defied her shaking hands, left her lips. The words were so unexpected, so deeply personal and piercing, that the entire universe of the restaurant seemed to grind to a halt, freezing Sterling Blackwood in a tableau of sputtering rage. In that singular, defiant moment, the life of Clara Mayhew, a 22-year-old artist masquerading as a waitress, would be irrevocably altered. Clara Mayhew believed in details. It was the foundation of her art and the secret to her survival. She saw the world not as a grand canvas, but as an infinite collection of tiny, telling brushstrokes. She noticed the faint, almost invisible fraying on the cuff of a hedge fund manager's bespoke suit, betraying a nervous habit. She saw the way a society wife's smile never quite reached her eyes when she spoke of her husband's latest acquisition. She saw the loneliness in the solitary diner who came every Tuesday, ordering the same Dover sole and reading the same worn copy of Moby Dick. These observations filled the charcoal sketches in the worn moleskin notebook she kept tucked in her locker, portraits of a world she served but did not belong to. This eye for detail made her an exemplary waitress at the Gilded Lyre, a bastion of old New York elegance nestled on the Upper East Side. It wasn't a trendy hotspot, but a timeless institution where deals that shaped the city were brokered over Chateauneuf-du-Pape and conversations were kept at a decorous murmur. The Lyre demanded perfection. Its waiters moved with the silent grace of acolytes, their black and white uniforms as crisp as a freshly minted dollar bill. The restaurant's patriarch and owner, Mr. Alistair Finch, was a man in his late 70s who believed that tradition was the bedrock of civilization. He'd hired Clara 2 years ago, not because of her experience, which was minimal, but because, as he'd told her, "You have quiet hands and watchful eyes." This establishment values observation over conversation. For Clara, the Gilded Lyre was a gilded cage, a necessary purgatory. She wasn't a career waitress. She was an artist, a painter, whose dreams were as vivid and sprawling as the city itself. Her tiny, walk-up apartment in Washington Heights was more studio than living space, canvases leaning against every wall, the air thick with the scent of turpentine and linseed oil. Her single bed was pushed into a corner to make room for an easel that held her latest work in progress. A massive, photorealistic oil painting of an elderly man's hands, gnarled and stained with ink, carefully repairing the spine of an antique book. Every dollar she earned, every tip she squirreled away, went toward canvas, expensive pigments, and the faint, flickering hope of renting a small gallery space for a solo show. Her one, desperate shot at being seen. Her family back in Ohio saw her art as a frivolous hobby. "There's no security in paint, Clara," her father, a pragmatic man who'd spent 40 years as an accountant, would say during their strained weekly calls. "When are you going to get a real job with a 401k? They didn't understand that for her. Not painting was a kind of death. So she served the city's elite, studying their faces, their gestures, their subtle tells, and poured all that collected humanity onto her canvases in the quiet, lonely hours after her shift. That fateful Tuesday evening began like any other. The restaurant was humming with its usual controlled energy. Clara was in her section, deftly navigating between tables, her mind a catalogue of wine pairings and dietary restrictions. She was serving a quiet, older gentleman at table 12, a regular she knew only as Mr. Vance. He was a man of immense but understated wealth, the kind who wore a Patek Philippe watch, not for show, but because it was a reliable timepiece his father had given him. He was always polite, always engrossed in a book, and always left a tip that was exactly 25%, calculated to the penny. Clara had sketched his hands once, strong, capable, but marked by a profound stillness, as if they had built great things and were now content to rest. The disturbance began with the arrival of the party at table 7. Sterling Blackwood didn't walk into a room. He conquered it. He was a man in his early 50s, with a predator's sharp features, hair slicked back with a severity that matched his reputation as a ruthless corporate raider. He was infamous for vulture capitalism, buying struggling, historic companies, stripping them of their assets, and leaving gutted towns and shattered pensions in his wake. He was trailed by a younger, visibly nervous man, a junior executive by the look of him, and 2 severe-looking women who were likely lawyers or senior partners. Table 7 was not in Clara's section. It belonged to a seasoned waiter named Thomas, but fate, in the form of a spilled tray of oyster shells in the kitchen, intervened. Thomas, rushing to help a busboy, slipped and twisted his ankle. The maitre d', a man named Jean-Pierre whose composure was legendary, scanned the floor, his eyes landing on Clara. "Mayhew," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "You're on table 7, Mr. Blackwood. Be impeccable." Clara's heart gave a little trip-hammer beat. She'd heard stories about Blackwood from the staff. He was notoriously difficult, a man who seemed to derive pleasure from finding fault. She took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and approached the table, her professional mask firmly in place. "Good evening," she said, her voice smooth and even. "My name is Clara, and I will be your server this evening. May I begin with a cocktail or a look at our wine list?" Blackwood didn't even look up from his phone. He waved a dismissive hand. "Bring the 82 Petrus, and don't waste my time with the presentation ceremony. Just open it." Clara nodded, unfazed. The 82 Petrus was a legend, a bottle that cost more than her entire art school savings. "An excellent choice, sir." The evening devolved into a master class in psychological warfare. Blackwood sent back his appetizer, a seared foie gras, claiming it was a degree too cool. He complained that the ambient light was casting a displeasing shadow on his guest. He cross-examined Clara on the specific provenance of the chanterelle mushrooms with the condescension of a prosecutor grilling a hostile witness. Through it all, Clara remained a fortress of calm professionalism. She was polite, efficient, and unflappable, her face a neutral canvas. She had dealt with difficult men before. The key was to become invisible, a function rather than a person. But Blackwood wasn't content with simple demands. He seemed intent on breaking her. His cruelty was theatrical, performed for the benefit of his cowed associates. He was demonstrating his power, and she was merely the prop. The young executive beside him, whose name was David, looked miserable. When Blackwood berated Clara for taking a half-second too long to refill his water glass, David flinched, as if he'd been struck himself. At table 12, Arthur Vance had lowered his book. He was watching the drama unfold with a deep, weary crease between his brows. He knew of Sterling Blackwood, of course. Their worlds occasionally intersected in the rarefied air of corporate boardrooms and charity galas. Vance considered men like Blackwood to be a cancer on capitalism, soulless profiteers who had replaced the honor of building things with the grubby thrill of tearing them down. He watched the young waitress, her posture erect, her face serene, absorb the billionaire's abuse with a grace that was both admirable and painful to witness. He felt a familiar pang of disgust, followed by an equally familiar wave of inertia. This was the world now. Crude, loud, and graceless. What could one old man do about it? He picked up his book again, trying to lose himself in the pages, but his eyes kept drifting back to table 7. The breaking point came with the main course. Blackwood had ordered the dry-aged porterhouse, cooked medium rare. The kitchen, under the exacting eye of Chef Antoine, prepared it perfectly. Clara delivered it with her usual quiet efficiency. Blackwood sliced into the center, chewed one piece with exaggerated deliberation, and then pushed the plate away. "This is medium," he declared, his voice rising, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. "Not medium rare. Is competence such a rare commodity in this city?" "I apologize, sir," Clara said, her voice still steady. "I can have the chef prepare another for you immediately." "And wait another 20 minutes? My time is worth more than this entire restaurant, young lady," he sneered. Then he did something that crossed a line from demanding to depraved. He looked at his young associate, David. "You know, David, this is a lesson. This is what failure looks like. A simple task, a simple instruction, and it's fumbled. This is why people like her," he said, gesturing at Clara with his fork, "end up serving people like us." David turned a shade of pale grey. The entire section of the restaurant had fallen quiet. Clara felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up her neck, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. It was the same feeling she'd had when her father had found her portfolio for the Rhode Island School of Design and told her to stop wasting her time on childish fantasies. She had swallowed her words then, and she had been swallowing them ever since. Blackwood wasn't finished. He reveled in the silence, in the captive audience. "I mean, look at her. No ambition, no drive, just serving. It's pitiful." He then turned his full, venomous attention back to Clara. "What do you even dream about at night? A bigger tip? A day off? I build empires. I move markets. What do you do?" The world slowed down. The ambient clink of cutlery, the soft piano melody from the bar, the murmur of distant conversations, it all faded into a dull roar in Clara's ears. All she could see was Sterling Blackwood's smug, cruel face. And in that moment, her artist's eye, the part of her that saw everything, took over. She wasn't looking at a billionaire. She was looking at a subject. She saw the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in the hand holding the fork, the sweat beading on his upper lip despite the room's cool temperature. He was performing, a stage actor terrified of being found out. And then she saw it, the detail that unraveled the entire tapestry of his power. On the pinky finger of his left hand, nestled amongst the ostentatious gleam of his platinum watch and a gaudy sapphire ring, was a simple, thin gold band. It was worn, scratched, and utterly out of place. It wasn't a wedding ring, which he wore on the correct finger. This was something else. It was the kind of ring a person might get from a high school sweetheart, or perhaps win at a county fair. It was a ring of sentiment, of memory, of a life lived before the predator had been born. And as he gestured, his hand shaking with performative rage, his thumb was unconsciously, compulsively rubbing the surface of that simple, worn band. It was his tell, his anchor to a self he had buried under mountains of money and cruelty. Something inside Clara snapped. The years of quiet deference, of bottling up her voice, of accepting her place, crumbled to dust. She was no longer a waitress. She was an artist, and the truth was her medium. She straightened to her full height, which was not considerable, but in that moment, she felt monumental. She met Sterling Blackwood's glare, her own eyes clear and steady. The trembling had stopped. "That ring on your finger, sir," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying across the silent restaurant with the resonant clarity of a struck bell. "It doesn't match the rest of your story." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered every other sound in the room. Jean-Pierre froze, a decanter hovering over a wine glass. The pianist's hands stopped over the keys. Diners stared, forks halfway to their mouths. Even Blackwood's sycophantic guests looked at her, their mouths agape. Sterling Blackwood's face went through a rapid, fascinating series of transformations. First, shock. Then, utter disbelief. His eyes darted down to his own hand, to the simple gold band, as if he were seeing it for the first time. He snatched his hand back, tucking it under the table as if it had been burned. Finally, a wave of dark, mottled crimson flooded his face, a rage so profound it seemed to suck the air from his vicinity. He sputtered, words failing him for the first time all evening. What did you say to me?" Clara held his gaze. She did not repeat herself. She didn't need to. The precision of her strike had been devastating. She hadn't insulted his wealth or his power. She had insulted his authenticity. She had seen the scared boy from a place with county fairs hiding inside the monster, and she had called him out. From table 12, Arthur Vance slowly, deliberately, placed his book face down on the table. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. He began to clap. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but a steady, rhythmic applause. A moment later, a woman at the adjacent table, dressed in elegant pearls, joined in. Then her husband. Soon a ripple of applause, quiet but resolute, spread through the dining room. It was not a standing ovation, but something far more powerful. A quiet consensus, a collective judgment rendered against cruelty. Blackwood shot to his feet, his chair screeching against the polished floor. "How dare you!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with fury. "Do you know who I am? I will own this place by morning. I will have you fired. You'll never work in this city again. You'll be serving fries in a backwater diner by the end of the week." He threw a black American Express card onto the table. "I'm done here," he snarled at his companions. "Let's go." He stormed toward the exit, his bodyguards materializing from the shadows to clear his path, leaving his stunned guests and the reverberating silence in his wake. Clara stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt the adrenaline, the terror, and a dizzying, unfamiliar surge of triumph. She had spoken. After a lifetime of silence, she had used her voice. She didn't know if she had just ruined her life or saved it. But as she looked at the simple gold ring Blackwood had tried to hide, she knew, with an artist's certainty, that she had painted her masterpiece. The aftermath of Sterling Blackwood's exit was a surreal tableau of suspended animation. The applause had died down, replaced by a low, excited buzz of conversation, as diners dissected the extraordinary scene they had just witnessed. Clara remained rooted to the spot by table 7, her legs feeling like they were made of cotton. Jean-Pierre was the first to move, gliding to her side, his usual unflappable demeanor replaced by a look of profound conflict. "Clara," he began, his voice a low whisper, "go to the staff room. Now, I will handle this." She nodded numbly and turned, her movements stiff and robotic. As she walked away, she felt dozens of pairs of eyes on her back, some curious, some admiring, some pitying. She didn't dare look at Mr. Vance's table, but she felt his gaze, thoughtful and appraising. In the sterile quiet of the staff locker room, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving a cold, creeping dread in its place. She sank onto a bench, her head in her hands. What had she done? Blackwood's threats echoed in her mind. "You'll never work in this city again." He was a man with the power to make good on such a promise. She had thrown away her job, her only source of income, the very means by which she funded her art, for a single moment of defiance. The rent for her tiny studio was due in a week. Her canvases and paints were not cheap. The dream of a solo show, once a distant but tangible star, now felt like it had collapsed into a black hole. Her locker door was a collage of postcards of paintings she admired, a Vermeer, a Sargent, a Hopper. They were her gods, her inspiration. Tonight, she felt she had failed them, sacrificing her art for a moment of pride. Tears of frustration and fear welled in her eyes. 10 minutes later, Jean-Pierre entered, followed by the imposing figure of Chef Antoine, his towering white toque making him look like a furious French general. Clara braced herself for the inevitable. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It was unprofessional. I lost my composure. I'll clear out my locker." Chef Antoine folded his massive arms across his chest, his expression grim. "Unprofessional," he boomed, his French accent thick. "Mademoiselle, what you did was magnificent." Clara looked up, stunned. "That man, that cochon, he has insulted my kitchen before," the chef continued, a flicker of fire in his eyes. "He sends back a perfect steak. He questions the integrity of my ingredients, but no one has ever silenced him. You, with your words, you filleted him like a fish." Jean-Pierre managed a thin, weary smile. "The owner, Mr. Finch, has been called. He is on his way in. The situation is delicate. Blackwood is not a man to be trifled with." "I know," Clara said, her voice small. "He'll destroy the restaurant's reputation." "Perhaps," Jean-Pierre conceded. "Or perhaps not. You have an admirer." "The gentleman at table 12, Mr. Vance. He asked to speak with Mr. Finch personally when he arrives. He also paid for Mr. Blackwood's entire bill, including the untouched steak and the half-drunk bottle of Petrus. He left this for you." He handed Clara an envelope. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a neatly folded stack of $100 bills, far more than the bill itself. Tucked within was Mr. Vance's business card. On the back, in elegant fountain pen script, were 3 words: "Courage has a price." The money was a lifeline, but the message was a puzzle. She felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the grim reality. Mr. Finch was an old-school traditionalist. A public confrontation, no matter how justified, was a cardinal sin in his establishment. When Alistair Finch arrived an hour later, he looked every one of his 78 years. He was a slight man, but carried himself with an authority that commanded respect. He first went to the now empty table 12, where Arthur Vance had waited for him. The 2 men, old acquaintances from a bygone era of New York society, spoke in low tones for nearly 15 minutes. From the staff room, Clara could only watch and wait, her fate being decided over an empty table. Finally, Mr. Finch beckoned her into his small, book-lined office. The room smelled of leather and lemon polish. He sat behind his large mahogany desk and gestured for her to take the chair opposite him. He was silent for a long moment, studying her with his pale blue eyes. "Miss Mayhew," he began, his voice dry as autumn leaves. In the 45 years I have owned the Gilded Lyre, I have never had a member of my staff engage in a verbal altercation with a patron. It is the antithesis of everything we stand for. Service, true service, is about quiet dignity, about absorbing the slings and arrows of a difficult world so that our guests may have a few hours of peace. Clara's heart sank. This was it. I understand, sir, and I am prepared to accept the consequences. He held up a hand. Let me finish. I have also, in those 45 years, never witnessed an act of such calculated public cruelty as that displayed by Mr. Blackwood tonight. He did not come here to dine. He came here to inflict pain. There is a difference. He paused, looking at a framed photograph on his desk of a much younger him with his late wife. Arthur Vance tells me you are an artist. Clara blinked, thrown by the sudden change of topic. Yes, sir. I paint. He said you have a good eye, that you saw something others missed. That is why you were hired, Miss Mayhew, for your eye. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. The world is changing. Men like Sterling Blackwood, these wrecking balls of commerce, they are the new kings. They believe their wealth absolves them of decency. They believe that service is subservience. Tonight you reminded one of them, and indeed the rest of my dining room, that it is not. You upheld a standard of human dignity that is, I fear, becoming a relic. He sighed, a long, weary sound. I cannot condone your outburst. It sets a dangerous precedent. However, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, I cannot bring myself to condemn it either. Arthur Vance made a compelling case on your behalf. He also made a significant donation to our Employee Relief Fund. So, I'm not fired? Clara asked, hardly daring to believe it. You are on probation, Mr. Finch said sternly. For 1 month, 1 toe out of line, 1 sharp word, and you are gone. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Absolutely. Thank you, she breathed, a wave of relief so profound it left her lightheaded. Don't thank me, he said, his expression softening slightly. Thank Mr. Vance, and thank that artist's eye of yours. Now go home. I suspect tomorrow will be eventful. He was right. By the next morning, the story was already beginning to seep into the city's digital bloodstream. A diner at the restaurant, a well-known food blogger, had written a breathless, detailed account of the entire confrontation on her popular blog. She didn't use names, referring only to a notorious corporate raider and a brilliantly defiant waitress. But the details were specific enough for anyone in the know to connect the dots. The post was titled, At the Gilded Lyre, a lesson in what money can't buy. By noon, it was a trending topic on Twitter. The phrase, doesn't match the rest of your story, became a meme, used to call out hypocrisy everywhere. Clara's phone buzzed with texts from friends and fellow waiters. Her anonymity was a thin veil, easily pierced. Sterling Blackwood, predictably, began his counterattack. A flood of 1-star reviews suddenly appeared for the Gilded Lyre on every platform, all posted by newly created accounts. They told lurid, fabricated tales of rude staff, cold food, and unsanitary conditions. A sleazy online gossip columnist, known to be on Blackwood's payroll, ran a story painting him as the victim of an unhinged, fame-seeking waitress in a restaurant that had lost its touch. Clara felt sick as she read the lies. This was how men like Blackwood fought, not with honor, but with a scorched earth campaign of disinformation. She had won the battle, but he was intent on making her and the Gilded Lyre lose the war. That afternoon, she received an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line was simple: an inquiry. Dear Ms. Mayhew, your employer, Mr. Finch, provided me with this email address. My name is Arthur Vance. I was the man with the book at table 12 last night. I find myself in a peculiar situation. I am in possession of a collection of paintings inherited from my late wife, Eleanor. The insurance company requires a new, detailed catalogue for their records. Not a financial appraisal, but a descriptive one. An inventory of the soul of the collection, if you will. It requires a keen eye for detail and an appreciation for the story a painting tells beyond its frame. Mr. Finch speaks highly of your observational skills. Your actions last night suggest you posse. The email arrived like a ghost in the machine, a string of impossible words materializing on the cracked screen of her aging laptop. Clara read it once, her breath catching in her throat. She read it a second time, her mind struggling to bridge the chasm between the sterile, fluorescent light of her kitchen and the sun-drenched promise of a Hudson Valley estate. A paid artist's residency. The phrase was a piece of arcane poetry, a spell from a life she had only ever dared to sketch in the margins of her own. Doubt, a cold and familiar companion, settled in beside her. This was charity, wasn't it? A rich man's guilt-assuaging gesture, a lavish tip for the evening's entertainment. The thought soured the nascent hope in her chest. She was the waitress who had caused a scene, a momentary diversion. Arthur Vance wasn't commissioning an artist. He was placating a problem. He was paying for her silence, for her to disappear gracefully from the battlefield she had inadvertently created. The business card lay on her counter, the ink of his handwriting, a stark, elegant accusation. Courage has a price. She had thought it a reward. Now she feared it was a bill. She walked to her easel, the scent of turpentine and linseed oil, a comforting liturgy. The half-finished painting of the bookbinder's hands stared back at her. Every line, every liver spot and raised vein was a testament to a life of patient, quiet work. That was the art she understood. This offer, this felt like a performance. She would be playing the part of the perceptive artist, a role she had been cast in during a single, reckless moment of improvisation. What if she failed? What if her one flash of insight was just that? A fluke, a lucky shot in the dark. The fear was paralyzing. It was one thing to be a waitress dreaming of being an artist. It was another, terrifying thing to be given the chance and be found wanting. But then, another thought, sharp and clear as a brushstroke of pure white, cut through the fear. What was the alternative? To stay here? To return to the Gilded Lyre, her month of probation a tight collar around her neck, forever known as the waitress who talked back? To let Blackwood's sneering caricature of her? No ambition, no drive, just serving. Become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The memory of his face, contorted with a rage that was really just terrified vanity, ignited a flicker of the same defiant fire from that night. She looked again at the painting on the easel. She wasn't just painting hands, she was painting a story of dignity, of craft, of a legacy held in the delicate act of repair. Mr. Vance wasn't asking her to paint. He was asking her to do what she already did, what she couldn't stop doing. He was asking her to see. Her art was not a hobby. It was the very lens through which she processed the world. To refuse this offer would be to admit that her way of seeing had no value beyond the confines of her small apartment. It would be the ultimate concession to Blackwood and every other person who had ever told her that her dreams were frivolous. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. The weight of her past and the terrifying, luminous possibility of her future seemed to coalesce into a single point of pressure at the center of her chest. She typed her reply, a single word that felt less like an answer and more like a leap into an unknown canvas. Yes. The Vance estate, named Eleanor's Reach on the discreet stone gatepost, was not merely a house, it was a curated silence. As the car crunched up the long gravel drive, flanked by ancient oaks, Clara felt as if she were driving into a landscape painting, one where the artist had chosen a palette of deep greens, river slate blues, and the soft, hazy grey of memory. The manor itself, built of heavy, time-worn stone and draped in ivy, seemed to have grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. It gazed out over the Hudson with a serene, melancholic patience. Arthur Vance met her on the steps, not with the formal distance of an employer, but with the gentle solicitude of a host. He was dressed in worn corduroys and a cashmere sweater, the city armor of his bespoke suit shed like a second skin. Here, the weariness she'd seen at the restaurant was gone, replaced by a quiet, scholarly sorrow that seemed to emanate from him like a low hum. "Welcome, Clara," he said, his voice softer in the open air. "I'm glad you came. The house has been too quiet for too long." He led her inside, and she stepped into a world saturated with the life of a person she would never meet. It was Eleanor's house. Her presence was in the small, whimsical sculptures on the mantelpieces, in the worn velvet of a reading chair positioned to catch the morning light, in the books stacked not for decoration, but for consultation, their spines cracked with use. And it was, most powerfully, in the art. The collection was housed in a modern wing of the manor, a space of soaring ceilings and walls of glass that blurred the line between the gallery and the river landscape beyond. It was not a sterile, museum-like space. It was a conversation. A fierce, abstract slash of red paint argued with the placid gaze of a Dutch portrait across the room. A bronze sculpture of a dancer seemed to yearn for the impressionist water lilies shimmering on the adjacent wall. "Eleanor never bought for investment," Arthur explained, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the room, his gaze distant. "She said that was like buying a book for the value of its paper. She collected dialogues. She believed every piece of art held within it the ghost of its creator, and she wanted our home to be filled with the most interesting ghosts." He paused before a striking portrait of a young woman whose defiant eyes seemed to follow them. "This is why I asked you here, Clara. The insurance catalogue is a pretense, a necessary fiction. The truth is, I find I can no longer hear them." He gestured vaguely to the paintings. "The ghosts. Since she passed, the conversation has gone silent for me. I see the paint, the frames, the wall labels, but the stories, her stories, are fading. I look at this portrait, and I remember Eleanor telling me about the artist's struggle, about the single brushstroke under the eye that held all the sitter's sorrow. She saw it instantly. I look now, and all I see is pigment." His voice was heavy with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight in the room. "That night at the restaurant, when you spoke about Blackwood's ring, you didn't just see a piece of jewelry. You saw the underpainting of his life. You saw what didn't belong, the false note in his composition. You saw, for a moment, the way Eleanor used to see. I suppose I am selfishly hoping you can teach me how to see my own life again, to hear the ghosts she left for me." The weight of the task settled on Clara, no longer a job but a sacred trust. This wasn't a test of her talent, it was a plea for her vision. She was being asked to be a medium, to channel the stories that a grieving man could no longer access. The imposter syndrome she had feared was replaced by a surge of bone-deep empathy. She understood this language of loss, the fear of memories fading from vibrant color to monochrome. For the next 3 weeks, Clara lived inside the art. She would rise at dawn and enter the gallery as the first light slanted across the floor, changing the mood and texture of every piece. She chose a different painting each day to be her sole focus. She did not just look, she inhabited. She sat with a Rothko until its shimmering fields of colour seemed to pulse with her own heartbeat. She sketched the hands in an Egon Schiele, feeling the anguish in every contorted line. She read the artist's letters and journals from Arthur's vast library, cross-referencing their words with their brush strokes. Her notebook filled with observations that were more like prose poems than catalogue entries. On the portrait of the sad-eyed woman. He hasn't painted her face. He has painted the moment just after she has been told a devastating secret. Her mouth is composed, but her left eye is a fraction of a millimeter wider than her right. It is an aperture opening to a private abyss. The background is a flat, oppressive ochre, the colour of silence. On a small, turbulent seascape. This is not water. This is rage. The artist has used a palette knife to scar the canvas, dragging the white paint of the seafoam across the panes, grey, like fingernails down a slate. You don't watch this storm. You are drowning in it. All the while, the outside world intruded in small, sharp doses. News from her friends in the city painted a grim picture of Blackwood's war of attrition. The fake reviews were relentless. A syndicated columnist published a sneering op-ed about the entitlement of the service industry. Mr. Finch was holding firm, but the financial strain on the Gilded Lyre was real. Clara felt a pang of guilt, a nagging fear that her single act of defiance was bringing ruin upon the people who had given her a chance. She poured that anxiety, that righteous anger, back into her work, her writing becoming sharper, more focused, as if she were sharpening a weapon. She sent her first batch of notes to Arthur. He said nothing for 2 days. Clara's anxiety mounted. Had she failed? Was her interpretation too fanciful, too personal? On the 3rd morning, he found her in the gallery and simply handed her a cup of tea. "I read your notes on the seascape," he said, his voice thick. Eleanor bought that piece a month after her father died. She never told me why. She just said, "It knows." Reading your words, it was like hearing her voice in the room. "Thank you." He then led her to a small, unassuming painting that hung in his private study over the mantelpiece. It was a simple composition, a sunlit cottage, a field of wild flowers, a shadowed doorway. It was charming, but technically unremarkable compared to the masterpieces in the gallery. This was her heart piece, Arthur said softly. Her favourite. There's no great provenance. The artist is barely known. But Eleanor always said it held the most profound secret in the entire collection. A testament to building a life after everything is lost. He looked at Clara, his eyes searching hers. She never told me what it was. A final puzzle, perhaps. See what you can find. This was it, the culmination of her work. For days, Clara was consumed by the little painting. She studied it in every light. She sketched its composition, analyzed its brushwork. She found nothing. It was a perfectly executed, lovely painting, but it was mute. The secret remained locked away. Frustration gnawed at her. She felt like a fraud, her confidence crumbling. She had been granted access to this sacred space, and now, at the final threshold, she was failing. Defeated, she sat in the armchair opposite the painting late one evening, the room lit only by a desk lamp. She wasn't looking for anything anymore. She was just looking. Her gaze drifted over the canvas, tired and unfocused. She thought of her own work, of the thick, buttery feel of oil paint, the way pigments mixed, the way light was a lie you told with layers of color. Her eyes settled on the dark rectangle of the cottage doorway. It was just a shadow, a flat plane of Mars black and burnt umber. But shadows weren't flat. They were filled with reflected light, with color. A good painter knew that. She stood and walked closer, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat. She tilted her head, observing how the lamplight glanced off the surface of the canvas. It wasn't flat. Within the dark, matte paint of the shadow, something glittered. Not the glossy sheen of oil, but tiny, discrete points of light, almost invisible. They were like crushed stars, suspended in a tiny rectangular galaxy. Gold. Not gold paint, which would have had a brassy, uniform shine. This was something particulate, something precious and personal. The breath left her body in a rush. She knew, with an intuitive certainty that transcended logic, what she was seeing. She found Arthur in the library, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "The secret," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It isn't something in the painting. It's something in the paint. The shadow of the doorway, it's mixed with gold dust." She took a shaky breath. "It's not just gold. It's from a wedding ring, isn't it? A crushed wedding ring." Arthur's book slipped from his fingers. He stared at her, his face a mask of astonishment and dawning comprehension. He followed her to the study and, with a trembling hand, took a magnifying glass from his desk. He peered at the dark doorway, his breath fogging the lens. A long, shuddering sigh escaped him. "The artist," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I remember Eleanor telling me the story years ago, but I'd forgotten the details. She and her husband were refugees. He was a goldsmith. They lost everything escaping their home. He died of a fever a week after they arrived in America. All she had left of him was his simple gold wedding band." He looked from the painting to Clara, his eyes shining with unshed tears. She ground it to dust and mixed it into the paint for the threshold of the home they would never share. So that, in the painting at least, he would always be waiting for her in the doorway. He finally looked at her, a sense of wonder suffusing his features. "Eleanor searched for that secret for a month before she saw it. How did you?" Clara thought for a moment, the echo of her own words in a hushed, hostile restaurant returning to her. "I don't know," she said, the truth of it settling deep in her bones. It didn't match the rest of the story of the shadow." Arthur Vance let out a laugh that was half a sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated catharsis. It was the sound of a silence being broken, of a conversation finally being rejoined. Clara's solo show, 2 months later, was not held in a small, hopeful space. Sylvia Harding, the Soho gallery owner Arthur had introduced her to, had given her the main exhibition hall. The title of the show was The Gilded Cage, and it was a sensation before the doors even opened. The story, the defiant waitress, the billionaire bully, the secret benefactor, the artist unleashed, was an irresistible New York narrative. Clara walked through the gallery on the opening night in a state of dreamlike disbelief. Her work hung on pristine white walls, lit with a reverence she had previously only seen afforded to masters. They were her sketches made real, transformed into massive, hyper-realistic oil paintings. The nervous tick of the hedge fund manager was a frantic blur of fingers. The society wife's smile was a masterpiece of carefully rendered tension. 1,000 tiny cracks in the facade. And in the center of the main wall, commanding the entire room, was the piece titled An Unbecoming Story. It was not a portrait of Sterling Blackwood's face. It was a tight, claustrophobic close-up of his left hand against the starched white of a tablecloth. The Patek Philippe watch gleamed. The vulgar sapphire glittered. But they were just background noise. The focal point, rendered with an almost microscopic obsession, was the thin, worn gold band on his pinky finger. Clara had painted every scratch, every soft-edged dent, and resting on it, the skin of the thumb slightly indented from a lifetime of anxious friction, was his thumb. It was a portrait of a man's deepest, most fiercely guarded secret. It was a painting of the scared boy he had murdered to become the man he was. The gallery was a crush of people, the air buzzing with champagne-fueled conversation. She saw Mr. Finch, looking impossibly proud, standing with Chef Antoine. She saw the food blogger who had started it all, her face alight with triumph. She saw Arthur Vance, standing quietly in a corner, watching not the paintings, but the people looking at the paintings, a gentle, satisfied smile on his face. Then, the buzz in the room shifted. A pocket of silence formed near the entrance and spread outwards, a chill moving through the warmth. Clara turned and felt the air leave her lungs. Sterling Blackwood stood in the doorway. He was alone, without his usual entourage of sycophants and bodyguards. He looked thinner, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. He ignored the whispers, the pointed fingers, the sudden ubiquity of camera phones. His eyes scanned the room, cold and reptilian, until they found her. He began to walk towards her, his path clearing before him as if by an invisible force. He stopped a few feet away. For a moment, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held his gaze. She was not in uniform. She was not his servant. This was her space. She would not bow her head. He finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "This is quite the spectacle," he said, gesturing at the room. "You've done well for yourself. Spun quite the fairy tale out of one insubordinate comment." "I just painted the truth," Clara replied, her own voice steady, surprising her. His lip curled into a sneer. "Truth? You know nothing of the truth." His eyes flickered to the monumental painting of his hand on the wall behind her. He stared at it for a long, silent moment. The entire gallery held its breath. "That ring," he said, his voice dropping so low she could barely hear it. "It was my father's. He was a mechanic, wore it every day of his life. He worked his fingers to the bone in a factory that my company later acquired and liquidated. He died broke and bitter, thinking I was ashamed of him." He looked back at her, and for the first time, Clara saw something behind the predator's mask. It wasn't remorse. It was a cavernous, echoing emptiness. You think you see people? You see a caricature. You see what you need to see to make your little stories work. He took a step closer. "I could still destroy you," he hissed. "This gallery, your benefactor. I could burn it all to the ground. This little fantasy you've built for yourself is fragile." Clara didn't flinch. She looked at this powerful, broken man and saw him with the same clarity she'd had in the restaurant. He wasn't a monster. He was just a story that had lost its meaning. "You won't," she said, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact. "Because it wouldn't work. You tried to ruin the gilded liar with lies, but it only made them stronger. You tried to paint me as a villain, and it turned me into this." She gestured around the gallery. "The one thing you don't understand is that your kind of power only works in the dark, when people are afraid. But when someone turns on a light and really looks, the story falls apart. Your story fell apart, Mr. Blackwood. All I did was point it out. He stared at her, his jaw working silently. The rage, the bluster, the theatrical fury. It was all gone. All that was left was a tired, defeated old man. He gave a single, sharp nod, as if acknowledging a move in a game he had just lost. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the gallery, the crowd parting for him once more, not in fear, but in pity. A moment later, a young man with a familiar, nervous energy approached her. It was David. "I quit the next day," he said, confirming what she already knew. "I couldn't be part of that story anymore. I'm at a small startup now. Less money, more sleep." He smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. "I came tonight to say thank you, and to finally see the art." He looked past her at the painting of the hand. "Wow. You really saw it, didn't you?" Clara looked at her work, at the truth she had pulled from the shadows and placed into the light. She had learned on Eleanor's Reach that art wasn't just about seeing. It was about testifying. It was about bearing witness to the secrets hidden in a shadow, the history scratched into a ring, the humanity that survived even in the most gilded of cages. Her voice, once trapped, had found its true medium, and her future stretched before her, a vast, brilliant canvas, waiting for the next story to be told.